Hey folks, it's Dr. G, and I wanted to move forward with our discussion of thinking, language, and intelligence by finishing up our discussion of problem solving, judgment, and decision making, and then starting to really talk about language. Additional videos for the development of IQ tests and what we currently think and understand about intelligence will immediately follow up once I'm done with this one. So, the last time that we were here, we were talking about overconfidence and how oftentimes overconfidence will happen because we don't really have the feedback that we require to be able to judge whether or not we are actually good at something or bad at something, or whether we made the right decision or whether or not we made the wrong decision. And what we generally tend to find is that the more knowledge that you have about something interesting kind of happens. You actually tend to become a little bit underconfident. You become very aware of what you know and far more that you don't know. And that's not necessarily always very true for people that are just learning something. The more that you gain knowledge, the more information that you gain about your performance, the better you're able to notice where you're falling short. When you're typically overconfident, that's going to happen when you've just gotten knowledge and you think you know everything and you don't fully understand how much more you need to know. And this is sometimes what's referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, I want to talk about one more thing. Framing absolutely plays a role in the kind of choices that we make and the decisions that we make as well. So, for example, if I asked you the best way to market ground beef, would you want to market as 25% fat or 75% lean? Now, both of these have an identical amount of fat content and lean content, but we are currently, although this is starting to change with the keto diet, so take it with a grain of salt, generally most people will want to market it as 75% lean because that sounds much, much healthier than 25% fat. So one of the ways that you can kind of see how framing affects your decisions that you make is if any of you have ever been tempted to buy something that's on sale, and it's been marked down to like $100. And you're like, ooh, look at how much money I've saved on this. But you still have to bear in mind that A, you're not really saving anything. You're still paying $100 for something. And additionally, that markdown may not actually be real. It might actually be an attempt to get you to be more likely to buy something because now it's been discounted. So you're actually more likely to buy something that's been marked down to $100 than something that has its initial price start at $100. Framing can be a very, very powerful thing on us. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is a concept known as belief perseverance. This is a little bit different from confirmation bias, so I want to highlight the slight differences between the two. So confirmation bias is when we only cherry pick information that really supports our beliefs or our particular point of view. Belief perseverance is when we cling to those beliefs even in the face of contrary evidence. So even though we've got evidence against this idea, we are still going to cling to that idea as much as we can. So our current beliefs are going to affect our evaluation of evidence that is related to those beliefs. So back in 1987, Kunda actually made a group of men and a group of women read an article that linked caffeine consumption, hey, what's up? It's a special treat today, to breast cancer. So they gave these to both men and women, and of those men and women, some were low caffeine consumers and some were high caffeine consumers. So if you had to think about how this article was going to be received, how would it break down between the genders? How would it break down between low caffeine consumers and high caffeine consumers? So, interestingly enough, men tended to rate the article similarly. They weren't really skeptical about it. And that really makes a lot of sense. Your average man does not have to worry about breast cancer. I think in people who identify as male, in this case, so cisgender men, that breast cancer rate is like 3% or even smaller. So this isn't something they generally have to worry about. Whether or not they consume caffeine has no bearing on this because men don't generally get breast cancer. Now, on the other hand, in women, it actually broke down based on how much caffeine they actually consumed. So women that don't really consume a lot of caffeine made similar ratings to males. Hey, they buy this. On the other hand, the women that were high caffeine consumers, the people who like hug their coffee every day and they're like, thank you for existing, were much more skeptical about the article. And it's really easy to see why that is. If the article is true, this means they have to give up caffeine. And maybe they don't necessarily want to do that. So you have a couple of options. You could admit that the article's true and give up caffeine. You can say the article's true and potentially put yourself at risk by continuing to consume caffeine. Or you could be skeptical, say, oh, it's just one study, it doesn't mean anything, and continue with your caffeine habit without worry or guilt. And that's often what we're going to do. When we get evidence that runs counter to what we believe, we're going to discount it or have skepticism about it because that would, if it were true, that would require us to change our beliefs and our habits, and most of us aren't necessarily always wanting to do that. So now let's move on to talk a little bit about language. So language does not just include what I'm speaking to you. It also includes anything that's written, anything that's gestured. Obviously, if I give you this in class, you have a pretty good understanding of what I am trying to tell you. It can also, what's really important is that it communicates both to yourself and to other people. So what's really critical here is that language allows us to share our thoughts and ideas and our beliefs with other people. And it actually helps us transmit culture and ideas from one person to the next and from one generation to the next. Our species significantly advanced once communication systems and speaking systems and writing systems were in place. That gave us a better way to transmit these ideas to a larger group of people. It's why when the printing press was invented by Gutenberg, more people were able to read and have access to writing than ever before. And that really changed what we were capable of. So I want to talk very briefly about language development. So children tend to learn their native languages very, very early on in life. And one of the things that you're going to notice is that there is a big difference between what we call receptive language, being able to understand what's being said around you, and productive language, where you're actually able to produce language. So one of the things that we're going to find out is that in infancy, receptive language develops much, much earlier than productive language. Receptive language usually starts between 4 to 7 months. You actually start understanding what people are trying to tell you. But most of us won't produce our first words, the beginning of productive language, until we're about a year old, give or take a month or two. Generally, once productive language has really come into play, the average child learns about 3,500 words per year. You will learn about 60,000 different words by the time that you graduate high school. So your ability to receive and understand language is critical, and it's something that we do very, very well. And for the most part, we do this without technical instruction. Most of us don't get an understanding of grammar or language arts until we're in middle school. And for the most part, despite that, we're able to speak our native languages pretty well. So when do we learn language? So usually evidence of receptive language, being able to understand, usually happens in one of the first stages, which is known as babbling. So I'm going to give you some really silly examples here, but it'll help you remember this for later because this will pop up on the third exam. So around 4 months, that's when we tend to find that babies are going to babble many different speech sounds, and this babbling is going to be very, very repetitive. It's going to be ba, 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 ma, 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 over and over again. And that's evidence that they're learning something about sound and they're trying to actually try to talk with us. By about 10 months, children are starting to combine different syllables together and say them with a very, very sentence-like intonation. So it'll sound like ba ma da ma ba. So it actually sounds like language, but it's not actually language. And that's evidence that they are getting closer and closer to having that productive language in addition to their receptive language. Usually by about 12 months, that's when productive language begins. This is when children produce their first words. And usually these first words will refer to very concrete objects, mama, dada. I think mine first one was bye-bye. I actually had somebody in a class a couple of years ago who said her first word was vacuum. So a lot of different things there, but it's usually going to refer to concrete objects that actually exist. Now, once you get that productive language, that one word stage, you see language develop very, very rapidly. By about 24 months or 2 years of age, you get into what we call the two-word stage. So speech becomes almost like you're talking through a telegram. So want kitty, give cookie, doggy sad. So I have these major content words, but I don't really have a lot of function words. So it sounds like I'm kind of talking through a telegram, which is why we sometimes refer to this as telegraphic speech. Now, once you get into the two-word stage, there is no 3-word, 4-word, or 5-word stage. Generally, once you get to the two-word stage, language is going to start developing very rapidly. Children are going to start speaking in complete sentences. By about 3 years old, they're going to sound like tiny little adults in some ways. Now, what's kind of interesting about language development is that no matter what language you speak, no matter what culture you come from, we have what Noam Chomsky referred to as an universal grammar. And what this means is that you are born with a built-in readiness to learn any language on earth. Now, that makes sense. It's a lot easier for us to start with a receptiveness to understand any language. And one of the ways that this has been demonstrated is that infants can actually discriminate between different speech sounds that do not occur in their culture. So for example, if you went to Japan, there is no distinction in Japanese between R and L. However, if you present R and L to very, very young infants that are born in Japan, they actually do discriminate between an R and L sound. Now, here's what's really critical. The more that they get exposed to their native language being spoken to them by their caregivers, they become an expert in that language and they lose their ability to discriminate between those sounds that are not in their language. So by the time that they're even a year old, they're not discriminating between R and L the way they used to originally. So the universal grammar exists so that you can be receptive to learning any language, and the environment that you're given will affect what kind of expert in what language you end up becoming. Now, there is a critical period for language. Generally, we know that if you are not exposed to language by the age of 7, you may not be able to learn language at all. People have tried to look at feral children, children who are raised on their own. They don't get exposed to language, and they don't pick up language learning as easily as children that are exposed to it are. Additionally, we do know that adults have a little more trouble learning new languages as adults. Now, that could be because they're not immersed in it, but even if you do learn a new language, you're probably going to have a very, very thick accent. So that's all I really have for language. We'll talk about intelligence